Paizo, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I am absolutely honored that you would include me as a guest NPC in the initial Playtest Adventure for the Starfinder 2e playtest. I was just blown away to see that you included me in that story. It is such an honor. And before any comments come in on this video, I just want to say I am not comically misinterpreting something for my own advantage. I'm in there. Today, we're going to talk about my group's experience with the Starfinder 2e playtest, and in particular, Chapter 1 of the adventure A Cosmic Birthday on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that is here to welcome you to Haunted Abs. And you know what? It's funnier if I don't give you the context for that statement. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to my thoughts about the Starfinder 2e playtest, or at least as far as my group has gotten into the Starfinder 2e playtest at my home gaming table. Back at Gen Con this year, Paizo released the playtest rules for Starfinder 2nd Edition, and all longtime fans of the channel should be aware that I am way too hyped for Starfinder 2e. I absolutely love the setting writing that Paizo uses for Starfinder 2e, so the fact that we're getting Starfinder with the Pathfinder 2e rule set, I am all on board that hype train, and my group has been doing the Starfinder 2e playtest at home. In particular, my group has been running A Cosmic Birthday. This is the Playtest Adventure that Paizo released back during Gen Con. This is an adventure that starts out at first level, and it takes place on Absalom Station as a new deity is born into the Starfinder setting. Now, overall, this adventure comes with 3 different chapters inside of it, and so far my group is about halfway through Chapter 2. However, with the Starfinder 2e playtest starting to wrap up, I wanted to go ahead and get a video with some of my ideas and thoughts about the Starfinder 2e playtest. I wanted to go ahead and put that out on the channel. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is talking about my group's experience with the first chapter of A Cosmic Birthday. If this video does well, or if there's a lot of interest from my community, after my group finishes chapters 2 and 3, I am totally willing to do some follow-up videos talking about my players' experiences as they've gotten further into this story. So please let me know if you would be interested in those follow-up videos. But in today's video, I'm going to be talking specifically about the first chapter of this adventure, where the PCs get stuck in the ominously named ghost levels beneath Absalom Station. Of course, before I go any farther, I guess I should say this video comes with some pretty big spoiler warnings for the adventure A Cosmic Birthday, and I'm basically going to be spoiling all of Chapter 1 of that adventure. So allow me to say that if you and your group are going to be playtesting Starfinder 2e, and you're going to be running this adventure, if you're going to be a player in that kind of game, it might be better for you to wait until you've gotten through Chapter 1 before you come back and watch the rest of this video, because I would hate to spoil some of the interesting things that happen. Of course, if your group is going to be running that adventure and you're interested in how the adventure goes, or maybe if your storyteller is looking for some advice about how to run the adventure, by all means feel free to send your storyteller this way so that they can watch this video and get an idea for some of the things they might want to keep in mind if they decide to run this adventure for themselves. I will say that Paizo has written this adventure in such a way that even when the full version of Starfinder 2e launches, they intend for this adventure to be something that can be played down the road, and you can see that in how the adventure is presented. So even though A Cosmic Birthday is technically a playtest adventure, this is one of those stories that I think could be sticking around in Paizo circles for years to come, and I will say up front that my group has really enjoyed it. So for this video today, I'm going to be breaking it into a few different sections. In the first section, I'm going to talk about the different ancestries and classes that my players chose, so you have an idea of what sort of group I was dealing with when I ran this adventure. Then I'm going to be talking about the setup for the adventure. I'm going to be talking about the ghost levels themselves, kind of the main chunk of Chapter 1. And then, after I get done with that, I'm going to give some of my overall thoughts about Chapter 1 and some of my big picture takeaways as a storyteller from this early stage of the playtest. I will tell you some of the concerns that I saw in Chapter 1 of this story. Now that my group has actually made it to Chapter 2, some of those issues that I've noticed, they are already starting to smooth themselves out. But still, for the sake of the Starfinder 2e playtest discussion, I do want to offer my candid thoughts, both positive and negative, about the first part of the adventure. So do understand in some ways that this video can be considered a review in progress. Of course, before we dive into all that, please remember to do all the stuff that helps support this channel. If you enjoy this content, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description below, along with a link to the Starfinder 2e playtest materials, as they can be found on Paizo's website. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. So to set the stage for this conversation, my regular Pathfinder 2e group took a break in their ongoing Pathfinder 2e campaign to participate in the Starfinder 2e playtest. Now, as a storyteller, I am blessed with a pretty sizable group, which means I've got a pretty healthy array of characters that I'm actually running through this playtest adventure. While not necessarily all of these players have been at every session, I do want to give you an idea of the characters that have been selected by my players so that you can know what I've been dealing with. And I will say, one of the big benefits of having a large group is all of the classes are getting tested at my table, and I've also got a pretty good array of other character options inside of the Starfinder 2e playtest that are showing up, so I do think I'm getting to see a lot of different facets of Starfinder 2e. I am very appreciative of that. Our first PC is named Elizabeth Maximoff. She is a human with the Galarian survivor heritage, and for her class, she is a witch warper, and basically this PC can be considered the Scarlet Witch from the MCU. Next up, we have an android operative by the name of Control-Alt-Delete, who is also a college student on Absalom Station, and who, shall we say, picked the wrong time to join a sightseeing group, but we'll get into that. We also have a Vesk Solarian and chef by the name of Sobek, who owns his own food truck known as Jay's Get Good Grub. Working alongside Sobek and helping to establish the right vibe for his food truck is a Skittermander mystic by the name of Moonbeam, who absolutely loves their essential oils and also uses the Akashic Record connection to cast their spells. Next up, we have a pair of operatives. One is a Yosoki hacker named Ghost, and the other is a Barai Versatile Heritage Kasatha by the name of Gorson. And then our final PC and dedicated group Hugmaster is a Skittermander soldier, better known as Skid Mandarin, and they are a Skitter Mandalorian. It is hilarious and I love it. So that is a quick overview of the different PCs that I've been running through this adventure, and as you can tell, all of the classes that are present in the initial Starfinder 2e playtest, I've got characters for every single one of those classes, including 2 different versions of the operative, so I'm actually getting to see every one of the classes in play, at least at some points during the game, and I think that's pretty cool. And while my group's clear obsession with Skittermanders can be seen in the characters I mentioned previously, I'm also glad to see that my players have gone for an array of different ancestries, and there's even some versatile heritages that are being used. I really think my group is getting to test out the variety of the system really well. I think that variety has been very beneficial for my group as we've been running through this story. But speaking of the story, let's go ahead and talk about the setup of the story and how this whole adventure gets rolling. Now, from this point going forward, allow me to stress there will be spoilers for the adventure A Cosmic Birthday. I'm going to be spoiling Chapter 1 of this adventure, so again, if you are a player who's going to be playing in A Cosmic Birthday, if you're going to be running that adventure, I highly recommend waiting until you are done with Chapter 1 before going any further in this video. Having said all that, the adventure opens when an NPC by the name of Jewel Kazama sends a message to each of the player characters telling them that they are looking for individuals to do a job that involves going up to a derelict spaceship that has been drug into orbit and asking the player characters to go on this spaceship, clear out any threats, and take an inventory of whatever is inside of the spaceship. Your players will actually begin the adventure as they are going to a meeting with Jewel Kazama, and they are at least vaguely aware of the fact that they are going to be presented a job involving a derelict spaceship. That is essentially your opening hook, and the particulars of how the player characters are connected to Jewel Kazama or are connected to each other, that is left entirely up to the storyteller to come up with. Now, what I'd like to do for a second is take a step back and tell you how I set up the adventure. The way I got my group of PCs together and set up the opening hook, there was actually a Starfinder 2e playtest, not really adventure, it's more just like a one-shot battle that was featured back at Gen Con. It involves a group of people who are at a theme park called Galarian World when a group of Jinsoul warriors attack and try to take over one of the attractions at this theme park, and the PCs are among the crowd that's just kind of caught up in this confusing and chaotic moment and have to respond to these crazy Jinsouls that are causing mayhem at a theme park. So the way I set up the adventure for my players, at the end of our session 0, after my players got done rolling up their characters, I did that one-shot fight for my players. They were all at Galarian World for a variety of different reasons. They could decide why their characters were there. So, for example, Sobek, the Vesk that owned the food truck, him and Moonbeam were there because they were serving customers, and some of my other PCs were there because they were just visiting the theme park. But as a quick one-shot fight at the end of my session 0 for this game, my PCs were all at Galarian World, they had to deal with this attack by Jinsoul warriors, and they earned just a little bit of fame in the community because they were the heroes who stepped up and responded to that event. This led into the actual opening of A Cosmic Birthday, where the NPC Jewel Kazama reaches out to the PCs to try to hire them because they are now famous local heroes. So that's how I did the opening hook for the story. They were essentially strangers who all got caught up in this event at Galarian World, and then because of their 5 minutes of fame in that fight at Galarian World, they were then contacted about a job that brought them back together for purposes of this larger adventure. Essentially, Jewel Kazama saw their work on TV and thought, hey, these might be the right people to help me out. So he reaches out, contacts the PCs, and they're all coming to his scrapyard in order to iron out the final details of the mission and set out on this adventure where they're going to go explore a derelict spaceship. Now, there are a couple of things I'd like to say here. First up, maybe it's just me, but when I saw the artwork of the NPC Jewel Kazama, I immediately thought that this Vesk scrapyard owner just reminded me of the actor Jack Nicholson so much that immediately in every interaction with Jewel Kazama, he adopted the persona of Jack Nicholson, and Jewel Kazama is now essentially known as Vesk Nicholson at my gaming table. It may just be a personal thing, but that's how I chose to portray the character, and my groups have a lot of fun with it. On a more serious note, something that you may note in the description I'm giving you of the adventure so far is that the opening hook of this adventure does not at all match the description of what the adventure is. And this is something that was a little bit stressful for me as a storyteller, Because in the opening description I gave you of this adventure, I talked about how the PCs are going to get stuck in the ghost levels beneath Absalom Station. And the thing about that description is, that is a description I was aware of about this adventure before I ever opened this adventure. Even in just the casual listening I did about the Starfinder 2e playtest, I knew that this adventure, A Cosmic Birthday, was going to feature PCs getting stuck in a place called the Ghost Levels. So the common description of this adventure would tell your players that they are at Absalom Station, they're going to go down to the Ghost Levels for some reason, and then have to do an adventure there. But the opening hook of this adventure is that an NPC calls them and tells them, hey, there's a starship up there, I want you to go clean it out. And the reason I'm pointing this out is, the opening hook of A Cosmic Birthday is very much a red herring. It is intended to throw your players kind of off the trail a bit, and then surprise them with the ghost levels, but the problem is, I feel like it's pretty common knowledge that the ghost levels is the opening of this adventure, and if you're a storyteller who's getting ready to run this adventure, there is a real possibility that one of your players has just casually heard about the direction this story goes. I accidentally mentioned the fact that the ghost levels were a prominent feature in this story a few different times during Session 0 before I actually realized the way the story hooks into the ghost levels, but thankfully my players weren't paying too close attention because they didn't catch the fact that they were getting set up. But as a storyteller, if you are running the story, I would be very tight-lipped about the existence of the ghost levels until they actually become part of the story. Otherwise, there is a real chance that you might spoil one of the big events in Chapter 1, or at the very least, send up some red flags that a canny player might notice. So again, just let me stress, as a storyteller, do not mention the ghost levels until you are ready to send your players to the ghost levels. That is very important. Still, stepping back into the story, all the PCs should arrive at Vesk Nicholson's scrapyard. Sorry, that's just the character for me. And they'll have an opportunity to interact with the NPC, get some details about this derelict starship that they're going to be dealing with, and from there they're going to be encouraged to gather some supplies before they travel to the starship, because Jewel Kazama ultimately doesn't know what kind of threats they might encounter while they're clearing that derelict starship out. Now, what the adventure is very obviously doing here is it is encouraging the players to prepare for a very unknown scenario, so that whatever happens, they will hopefully be ready for what is to come. So even though you're kind of pulling a bait and switch on them in terms of the story, they're going to be going to the ghost levels instead of this starship, the fact that players are encouraged to spend some time gathering a variety of supplies does mean that when your players go to the ghost levels, they shouldn't be just completely without resources. Now, in the adventure itself, Jewel Kazama recommends that the players actually go out and go to different stores and just buy whatever they need around town. But what I actually did is I just allowed the players to buy supplies off of the different things that Jewel Kazama had actually collected at his scrapyard. And I mostly did that because I know my players, if I allow them to split the party, they are definitely going to split the party. So I just put convenient shopping right there by the quest giver in order to keep the group together. Because once the group is done gathering supplies, Jewel Kazama is going to send them up an elevator to one of his friends who can give them a ride out to the derelict starship, and that trip up the elevator is going to be a significant event. The other thing that you're going to be sprinkling into the setup of this story, and let me say, this is an element that is very much on the front cover of the book, so this isn't going to be too big of a spoiler for your players. This adventure is going to take place on Absalom Station during the birth of a new deity for the Starfinder setting called the Newborn. Essentially, these creatures called midwives are, well, Since I'm not doing the later chapters yet, I'm not going to go into exactly what the midwives are doing, but there are these creatures called midwives that have arrived at Absalom Station, and your players are actually going to see one of these creatures during Chapter 1. They are very much tied to the birth of this new deity that's coming to the Starfinder setting. However, the arrival of the midwives is not the only thing that is associated with the birth of this new god. There's also been a great influx of cultists into the Pact World system as these cultists prepare for the arrival of their new deity. This means that in the setup for the adventure, you want your players to encounter some of these cultists who are just kind of going up and down the streets, or maybe buying something at Jewel Kazama's scrapyard. You want your PCs to actually encounter some of these cultists and have just a brief opportunity to interact with them, because this is going to feed into the larger story. The reason I want to stress this is, the cultists of this new deity, the Newborn, are not necessarily a hostile organization, and you want your players to have at least a few neutral or possibly even positive interactions with cultists of the Newborn, so that your PCs don't get too skewed of a view of this organization too early in the adventure. Mostly what this boiled down to for my PCs was them encountering a group of cultists that were singing the song Happy Birthday in a variety of languages, and several of my players just jovially joined in and started singing Happy Birthday as well, with no idea who they were singing Happy Birthday to. One of my PCs, Moonbeam the Skittermander Mystic, actually had the presence of mind to look at one of the cultists and ask whose birthday it was. The cultist said that their new deity was about to arrive, and Moonbeam the Skittermander asked, "Oh, when will they get here?" And the cultist said ominously, "They could arrive at any minute." My group laughed this off and proceeded to the elevator that they needed to take up so that they could go on their starship adventure. And that is where the fun begins. The first serious encounter in Chapter 1 of A Cosmic Birthday is this elevator ride. Essentially, as the PCs are riding this elevator up to go do their job, this new deity is going to be born, and it's going to result in just shockwaves across the Pact World system. The way this played out for my group was, as they were riding up, I gave them an opportunity to roll some perception checks when the Yosoki operative noticed that some of the buttons on the elevator were flashing out in binary code, spelling out the phrase Happy Birthday. That was a fun little extra that I added in, but it allowed them to use both their perception and computer skill, which was core to their character, and gave them a little bit of a heads up that something was wrong. They began investigating the elevator to try to figure out what was going on, when suddenly the elevator lurched violently, and the lights began to flicker wildly in the room. In between flashes of light on this elevator, they saw very brief glimpses of the midwife I previously showed you, and then, with a resounding screech, the elevator dropped. This is your opening scenario, and thankfully my players were caught completely off guard by this. I think this scene is great, and if you can catch your PCs by surprise, this is a ton of fun. I honestly think this is a great opening. The PCs are essentially trapped inside of this elevator, and they have a limited amount of time to try to partially repair the elevator and slow its descent before it crashes into the ground at the bottom. Now, honestly, my players made some pretty amazing rolls on this opening hazard, so my PCs were not actually injured by this hazard, but just the shock of this moment was a fantastic intro. So allow me to say, Storytellers, do everything you can to make this moment a surprise. It was a good moment for my players. Because my players were so successful, the elevator came to a slow stop and the doors slid open, revealing the dark, deep hallways and tunnels that rest beneath Absalom Station. And as they glanced through the doors, my PCs noticed that small bits of ghost fire were flickering throughout the tunnels. Excellent ambiance added into the fear and shock value of this opening scenario. What this is going to do narratively is it's going to trap your PCs well below the main levels of Absalom Station. The ghost levels are a strange planar phenomenon in Absalom that exist essentially alongside regular Absalom Station. Sometimes some portions of the station will shift over to these ghost levels, and if somebody's in the wrong place at the wrong time, they might find themselves in what is essentially a parallel dimension to the main one that is Absalom Station. That's where your PCs are. What has happened as a result of this opening, when the elevator came crashing down, it actually fell into a section of the ghost levels, and as a result, the elevator has been disconnected from its normal power source. This means that in order for your players to actually escape the ghost levels, they're going to need to do one of two things. The first option is they can try to repair and repower the elevator that they came in on. This means that they're going to need to explore the ghost levels, find some suitable parts to repair the elevator, and then find some way to repower the elevator and then take it back up to the surface. The alternate option is to find some other means of escape, which, spoiler alert, is basically just another elevator. Essentially, the players can escape on the elevator they came in on, or they can find another elevator to power up and ride that one back up, but those are going to be the two major ways that your players can get out of this, and from there, the ghost levels beneath Absalom Station is essentially a large free-form dungeon that your players can approach in any fashion that they wish. Honestly, I really loved this dungeon. Now, this dungeon is actually printed on the inside cover of A Cosmic Birthday. But I don't believe Paizo has created an actual physical printed map that you can use. If they did, I'm not personally aware of it. What I actually did for my players is I just recreated the map up on this board. But the elevator that your players crash in on essentially drops in the dead center of the map. And then you have these major regions around the central elevator that your players can explore and try to find a way back out. When your players first step out of the elevator, after either slowing the descent or crashing to the bottom, they're going to encounter a series of 4 cleaning robots that are charged with keeping this section of the station clean. But as a result of this incredible power surge, the circuitry of these robots has fried, they've gone crazy, and they are immediately going to attack the players. This is going to give your PCs a heads up that any kind of technological equipment that they encounter has the possibility that it has been messed up by whatever weird event also fried the elevator. The actual fight with the cleaning robots is pretty simple, but given the fact that there's a real possibility your characters just crash to the bottom of an elevator shaft, I can understand why this fight was pretty simple and straightforward. Mostly I feel like it's there just to tell players that they can't necessarily trust any technology that they encounter, which will put them on guard for other things that they encounter throughout the rest of the Ghost Levels complex. Now, before we go any further into what my players actually did inside of the Ghost Levels, I would like to help storytellers kind of get a big picture of how this dungeon crawl is laid out. I really like this dungeon crawl, and I think there's a lot of fun stuff in it. My players definitely had a lot of fun with the different encounters inside of this dungeon crawl, but because Into the Ghost Levels is kind of a free-form dungeon crawl where your players can go any direction that they want to go and approach challenges in any way that they would like to, that does mean it's a little bit, for lack of a better word, incoherent when you're first looking at it. I had to read through this dungeon crawl 3 different times before I really had my brain wrapped around the adventure, and as a storyteller I would recommend definitely take some time to get a good idea of what's going on so that you can keep the narrative coherent in your head as you're adapting to what your players are doing. Paizo actually gives us a pretty complex map of this section of the Ghost Levels. If you were to take the central hub where the elevator crashes at the beginning of this adventure, there are 2 very large hallways that stretch off of this section that are very clearly intended not to be the direction that your players go. They essentially lead deeper and deeper into the Ghost Levels, and the lack of lighting and features is intended to convey to your players that this is definitely not where they're going to find what they're looking for. Whenever I drew the map up on my board, I also conveniently labeled both of these hallways as definitely not a Tarrasque layer, just to encourage my players not to explore too deeply, and much to my surprise, they actually didn't try to go down the unlabeled tunnels. I'm impressed by their restraint for once. However, beyond these two larger tunnels that lead off from where the elevator is located, there are a series of smaller tunnels that lead to what are essentially 4 blocks that are arranged around that central elevator area. There's a block to the northwest, there's a block to the northeast, there's a block to the southwest, and there's a block to the southeast. And there are various rooms and tunnels off of each of these blocks that your players can explore and find different things that are going on. So that's kind of a brief description of the layout that you want to keep in mind. The next thing you need to consider is the narrative of what's going on, because there's actually a lot of things in play in this particular dungeon. You can kind of divide this dungeon into 4 different categories of events. The first category is a group of cultists that have holed up in this section of the dungeon, and this particular group of cultists is actually pretty hostile. They don't go into why this group of cultists is hostile, but they are markedly different from some of the other cultists that you can encounter during this story, both in Chapter 1 and in later chapters, and that's why I emphasized you want to have some neutral interactions before the ghost levels begin, because one of the encounters that your players can find in this section is a hostile group of cultists that are dedicated to this newborn deity. Another hostile group that is trapped in this section of the ghost levels is a group of scavengers who were originally down here looking for different things that they could scavenge to try to sell and make a quick buck. The scavengers and the cultists are very hostile to one another, and because they are so hostile to one another, they are inclined to attack anyone they meet just as soon as they see them because of the ongoing hostility between the two groups. There's also a third group that is down in this section of the ghost levels. It is a group that is going on a tour that got stuck in this section of the ghost levels when this strange phenomenon happened. This tour group is not hostile to anyone, but they are definitely terrified and holed up, and they kind of serve as a group that your PCs can come in and rescue as part of this adventure. This group of tourists offers some social interaction and some opportunities from roleplay that you wouldn't get from the other 2 groups that are stuck down here. The other 2 groups are hostile and are not likely to interact, so this third tour group is kind of stuck into this dungeon as sort of the social roleplay opportunity. So those are the 3 main groups, and then the 4th category for this dungeon crawl is basically your miscellaneous encounters. Different creatures, different hazards, different things that your players can stumble on that just happen to be in this section of the ghost levels that aren't necessarily related to any of the 3 groups I just discussed. So let's recap. Your PCs were on an elevator, it crashed into the ghost levels, and they find themselves in the center of this complex, and if they want to escape, they need to find parts to repair the elevator and find some way to recharge the elevator, or alternatively find another way out of this section, and they can approach exploration in any way they would like to. As they are exploring, they may run into any of the 3 groups that I mentioned, the cultist, the scavengers, or this lost tour group, and they're going to have to deal with a variety of creatures and hazards that are all down here in the ghost levels. Your players can go in any order they see fit, and depending on the choices that they make, they may encounter all of these things, or they may only encounter some of these things before they find a way out. My group only encountered about 3/4 of the stuff that was in this particular dungeon crawl. The shortest path to victory for your players would be to go first to the northwest corner, where they can find some spare parts that would allow them to repair the elevator, and then if they go to the southeast portion of the dungeon, they can find a machine where they can do some power rerouting and either turn the initial elevator back on or find an alternative cargo elevator that they could power up and then take back to the surface. So the quickest possible version of this story would be your players going northwest, finding parts, going southeast, turning the elevator back on, and escaping. But obviously, if they go other places, they might find and encounter other things. Now let's talk about what my players did. My players began by traveling towards the northwest. So they actually took what the adventure kind of assumes is going to be the default route through the adventure, at least initially. They followed one of the tunnels to the northwest, and off of this particular tunnel, there are two different rooms that they can enter. One is a very large, well-lit room that has some serious plot significance, and the other is a tiny, unlabeled room that is entirely empty. Experienced GMs at this point know exactly what my players did. Yes, that's right, they obsessed over the tiny, empty room with nothing in it. Seriously, Paizo, why did you put an empty room on the map? You know players are going to obsess over that. Ultimately, what I decided to do with that small room, just to keep the story moving, I made that the room where the cleaning robots that attack the party when they get off the elevator, I made that the room where their charging stations were stored, just so that there was a very obvious purpose to this room, and that allowed my players to quickly gather some scraps and keep moving. The most significant encounter in the northwest section is a large room that has a large animated advertisement that your players can encounter, and this large animated advertisement is actually a very significant hazard. By the way, at this point, allow me to say I'm not going to cover every single encounter that my players had, because there are some smaller encounters that are not that significant to the story. They're kind of those miscellaneous items that I mentioned earlier. But of the miscellaneous items that your characters can encounter, this advertisement hazard is intended to be a major moment, because disassembling this hazard is where your characters can find the parts that they need to repair an elevator. The way this hazard is set up, it is described as an advertisement that has some 3D hard-light characters that run across this advertisement and try to sell their products, but as a result of the power surge from the birth of the newborn, these advertisements have gone insane. After your players enter this room, the advertisements will play out one of their commercials before suddenly turning and attacking the PCs. If the players kill these hard-light advertisements that are attacking them, the commercial will play again on a loop, sending more of these hard-light advertisements out, meaning that in order for your players to beat this advertisement, they can't just kill these hard-light creatures that are attacking them, they actually have to find a way to disassemble the advertisement itself. I thought this was a really cool encounter. I loved this idea a lot, but there is one thing I will note that Paizo doesn't do here that as a storyteller you may want to think about, and that is, they don't tell you what the advertisement is for. Now, I do realize this is a bit of a trivial thing, but the generic idea of an advertisement creature attacking my players, that wasn't good enough for me, so I actually took some time to decide what the advertisements were. And in my case, I decided that these 3D creatures that were coming out of the advertisement were all different characters that were selling different types of toothpaste. Because I have a larger group than normal, I actually had 3 advertisements coming out. And so I came up with 3 different brands of toothpaste that these creatures were trying to sell, and then I decided that these advertisements had gone insane and decided that my players didn't have clean enough teeth and that's why they had to attack them. I came up with 3 brands really quick. One was called Orthoblast, one was called Dentasludge, the third one was supposed to be called Salvatooth, but my brain froze when I was describing the scene, and I accidentally said Salvatore instead. So I ended up with these 3 different toothpaste characters, Orthoblast, Dentasludge, and Salvatore, that were all attacking the party, and they had to try to fight off and then try to dismantle this hazard. And this ended up being an amazing encounter. My players absolutely loved it. They very quickly figured out they needed to dismantle the actual hazard. They actually did this before the first commercial loop, meaning that they actually started working on that part of the problem before any of these advertisements tried to respawn. My players were on top of that, but they also had some pretty terrible rolls, meaning that they were having the world's worst time fighting these hard-light advertisements that were coming after them. Technically, my players started trying to bend the rules at this point, but it was funny enough I had to let them. my players began to try to throw off these hard light advertisements by arguing that one of the brand's Dentisludge was responsible for the present state of their teeth, and then trying to turn the other two advertisements against that one. It was an absolutely hilarious moment of role-playing, and my wife, who was at the center of this scheme, rolled ridiculously well, so it was stretching the rules, but I allowed it. It turned into a great combat, lots of fun, my players really enjoyed it, and ultimately they were able to disarm the hazard, gather some supplies, and move on into other sections of the ghost levels. Next up, my players traveled from the northwest section over towards the northeast section, and allow me to say the northeast area is the most, I guess I would say, active of the different regions in this dungeon. There is honestly a lot that's going on in this particular section. The first portion that my players went through are a series of 3 trapped hallways, but the traps in these hallways are being controlled by a group of gremlins who are running amok and having a hilarious time because they enjoy the fact that the station is going haywire as a result of the power surge that just happened. So in moving through this area, the first thing my party had to do was find a way to get past the various traps that the gremlins were operating, and then they actually had to take the gremlins down so that they could shut the traps off. After that, they move around a corner, and this is where I made my entrance. Moving around the corner, they find a sign that says, "Welcome to Haunted Absalom Station. Tours starting at..." You see, as I mentioned earlier, there is a tourist group that was exploring this section of the Absalom Station when it got shunted into the Ghost Levels parallel dimension. So there is this tourist group that is trapped in the Ghost Levels with no way to escape. And they are being led by a Skittermander tour guide. This Skittermander is a local tour guide whose group experiences a disaster. I'm sorry, you cannot convince me otherwise. Paizo wrote me into their Starfinder 2e Playtest Adventure. I absolutely love Skittermanders. He is a local tour guide who experiences a disaster. I am in this story. Thank you, Paizo. I will accept no other explanation. The group encounters this sign that says, "Welcome to Haunted Absalom Station," with different tour times and when different events are scheduled, and then across from the sign, the tour group has locked themselves in a room where they were trying desperately to keep the gremlins from getting to them. Now, unbeknownst to my players, this tour group, in addition to being attacked by the gremlins, had also been attacked by the cultists and that group of scavengers that I mentioned earlier, meaning that basically everyone in this section of the tunnels has been hostile to this group of tourists. So they are all locked up inside this room, and this begins a social challenge, a social interaction role-playing segment where your players have to convince this group that they're not hostile, and then negotiate to get inside the room, and then ultimately arrange to try to lead this group of tourists out of the ghost levels where they can get some additional rewards for doing so. And my players did eventually do all of that, but they are my players, so some questionable choices were made first. The first thing that my players did before they even tried to talk to the group of tourists is they got down this sign that said, "Welcome to Haunted Absalom Station," and then deliberately broke it and used it to create a shield for the Skitter Mandalorian that just said, "Welcome to Haunted Abs." This is now an official item that my group is carrying around with them, the Welcome to Haunted Abs shield. But after creating their own custom tower shield to use as they explored these tunnels, they then decided that they needed to try and talk to this group of terrified tourists. So they go up to the door, and in order to persuade these tourists that they are in fact just friendly people who are here to help, they decide to start singing "Happy Birthday." My group randomly decided to imitate the cultist, because up until this point, my group has not encountered any of the hostile cultists. They don't know the hostile cultists are down here, and they don't know that this group has been attacked by hostile cultists. Which means that the social RP challenge got really complicated really fast as this group of tourists that were locked inside this room started freaking out because, oh no, they're back to get us. Eventually my party realized their mistake and they were able to calm the tourists back down. They managed to work their way inside of the room, and we actually ended our first session there as they sort of rested with the rest of this tour group to regather their energy and prepare to move deeper into the ghost levels and try to find their way out. Among this group of tourists was an android who had gone on these tours. This is where the android envoy joined our group. Control-Alt-Delete was one of the tourists that they rescued, and if you're a storyteller who is looking for a way to add in a late player to this adventure, this is a great spot to do that. You essentially have this group of faceless NPCs, so if you need to add in a new character at any point during this chapter, you can just say that they were one of these NPCs. It works very easily. At our next session, the party continued exploring the northeastern corner of the ghost levels, and the next group that they ran into was this hostile group of scavengers. The scavengers attacked pretty quickly, and my players turned into an elite commando squad out of nowhere because they just steamrolled this poor group of scavengers. I'm serious, it was one round, it was fast. There was no talking, there was no asking questions, there was no trying to calm the scavengers down. It was very much so a one-sided fight. Now, for storytellers who are running this, I will say that this fight represented a mistake that I made a few times in running this chapter. I run for a very large party, and I was about 50-50 on remembering to actually adjust for the fact that I have more than the usual number of PCs. With the hostile advertisements that I mentioned earlier, I remembered to up the challenge a bit. I added an extra advertisement so that the challenge was at the right level for my group. However, with this group of scavengers, I completely forgot to adjust for the fact that I had a larger party. Now, granted, given the ridiculous nature of the roles my players had at this point, I'm not sure that a properly adjusted and sized group would have made much difference. There were a lot of 19s and 20s in a single round in that particular moment, but if you are a storyteller who is running this chapter, be aware of the fact that you may need to make some adjustments to the various encounters to reflect the size of the group that you're running for. This adventure is built around a party of 4, but as I was running a group, it was typically a party of 6 to 8. If I forgot to increase the number of creatures in a particular encounter, those encounters often were a little too easy. However, at this point, my players just completely steamrolled this group of scavengers. Again, very one-sided fight. At this point, this room actually introduced what I think was a very interesting aspect of this dungeon that ultimately my players didn't get to do much with, which is the scavengers are actually up on some scaffolding that's up above the regular tunnels. There are 3 or 4 points throughout these tunnels where your players can climb up to some scaffolding and essentially explore a higher up level of this dungeon, and it can create some alternative access points to different rooms or different places that your PCs might go. My players ultimately decided not to use that scaffolding, and they didn't follow those different trails, when they first encountered them, and as I mentioned, my players found their way out about 75% of the way through the dungeon, and they never decided to go back and check those out, so unfortunately my players never really got to make use of that, but I do think it is a cool aspect of the dungeon design, and depending on the choices that your players make, I think it could lead to some interesting takes on how the exploration of this dungeon goes. After the party finished exploring the northeastern section, the next place that they went was to the southeastern section. Now, as you may remember, the quickest way through this dungeon is to go to the northwest, get the parts, go to the southeast, turn the elevator back on, and escape. So my players are, at this point, entering a section of the dungeon where they have all the things that they need if they're going to escape. The main room in the southeastern section of this dungeon is a large observatory that has been set up by the cultists, but the cultists have been run out of this observatory because it's been taken over by a hostile creature known as an electrovore, or, as my players insisted on calling it, the Sparky Danger Noodle. It's basically a flying electric eel that can send out bursts of electric energy. It is a pretty cool boss fight, and it's a pretty serious challenge. Despite the fact that I was running with a larger than normal party, this electrovore was a pretty serious threat. It did some really good damage to my players, and this fight definitely felt very, very stressful. But essentially what the players have to do in this section of the dungeon is they have to defeat this electrovore and then repair some of the damage that the electrovore has done to this observation station where the players have found themselves. And then once this observation station is repaired, they can reroute the power from this station back to an elevator and ride their way back to the surface. Now, as I mentioned, the electrovore is a pretty serious threat, and my players took a beating in this fight. So once this fight was over and my players figured out that they could turn the elevator back on and get back up to the surface, they had no motivation whatsoever to continue exploring. They hopped on the elevator, they went, and as a result, that was the end of Chapter 1 for my group. This means that my party completely missed the hostile group of cultists that were holed up in the southwest portion of the map. This does mean that even going into Chapter 2 of the adventure, that my players have only ever dealt with neutral or possibly even positive versions of the newborn cult. And if I have an opportunity to talk about Chapter 2, I will talk about how that's influenced the story. But my players just kind of completely skipped the hostile version of the cult that you can find in this dungeon. And as a storyteller, you should be aware that depending on the choices that your players make and the directions that they choose to go, there could be some significant encounters in this dungeon that your players just completely miss. Still, overall, I thought this dungeon was a lot of fun, and my players had a lot of fun too. I also had to tell them no, they could not adopt the Sparky Danger Noodle, but all in all, I think it had a lot of great moments. That initial drop on the elevator really caught my players off guard and really set a great tone for the adventure. And then just this exploration, you can go any direction you want, and what direction are we going to go? I thought that was pretty cool as well. I really loved the hazard that featured aggressive hard-light construct advertisements that attack the players. I thought that was a ton of fun, and the electrovore fight was a really good challenge. There's a few smaller encounters that I've skipped over because they're not as central to what your players are going to do down here. Probably my biggest disappointment was the encounter with the Scavengers, because like I said, my players just rolled ridiculously well and annihilated that encounter before it could really begin. But all in all, I thought this dungeon was well put together. I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought it had a lot of great moments. Really, the only challenge with this dungeon is just, as a storyteller, kind of understanding the big picture of what's going on so that you can react to the choices that your players make. So those were my thoughts about the dungeon itself and the first chapter of the adventure, but now I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about some of my observations as a storyteller of Starfinder 2e as a whole in the playtest. Now, the obvious caveats to this discussion are, essentially I'm talking about level 1 of the playtest right now. My players did one chapter, they leveled up to level 2 at the end of the chapter, and I am confining my commentary to just a few social interactions, a few hazards, and a few combats. But that being said, overall, the first chapter of the adventure and the mechanics that I encountered in the first chapter of the adventure, they felt like they were functioning fine. As someone who has run a lot of Pathfinder 2nd Edition and is familiar with how Pathfinder 2e works, seeing Starfinder 2e adapted to the same mechanics, it's flowing exactly like I expect it to flow, it's functioning exactly like I expect it to function, it's moving along well, and there weren't any real pain points that just jumped out to me and said, oh, this is going to be a problem. However, I will say this, I did notice that the spellcasting classes in Starfinder 2e are not as intuitive as the other classes inside the game. As I mentioned, I have one Mystic and one Witch Warper, and then 2 Operatives, a Soldier, a Solarian, and an Envoy. And in this first dungeon, one thing that I noticed is the Solarian, the Soldier, the Envoy, both of the Operatives, all 5 of those characters were using their unique class abilities very reliably and very effectively. However, both of my spellcasting players, the Witch Warper and the Mystic, while they were using their spells well, they weren't necessarily using the other features of their class as effectively. For example, the Mystic class has a feature called the Vitality Network, and the Witch Warper has a feature called a Quantum Field, and neither of my players actually used the Vitality Network or the Quantum Field during the entire first chapter. They used their spells, and they used their spells very effectively during the chapter, but both of those mechanics, which are intended to be major mechanics for their class, just kind of got completely forgotten throughout the entirety of Chapter 1. Now, I will say, if we come back to Chapter 2, I have seen both of my spellcasting players start to use these mechanics, but it did stand out to me as a storyteller that these mechanics are, for whatever reason, something that my players weren't going to for that entire first adventure. As someone with a lot of experience in different TTRPGs, one thing that I'm very familiar with is a lot of players often say things to the effect of, spellcasting makes my head hurt, and I've seen a lot of players over the years struggle to use spellcasting classes effectively, and I know that there are a lot of conversations in Pathfinder 2e about the martial caster divide, and I've gone on record saying that I think that some of those concerns are overblown, but at the same time, I do think that it's notable that my players have shown a slight preference for non-spellcasting classes, and my players who have used spellcasting classes, it seems like they're taking a little bit longer to get used to how to play those spellcasting classes. Again, if we get to talk about Chapter 2 in a future video, the players with the spellcasting PCs, they're getting a little more used to their class features and they're showing up more, but that notable lag was there and I felt it was worth pointing out. So my overall thoughts from the first chapter of A Cosmic Birthday, the base systems of Starfinder 2e seem to be running pretty well at this point. The game flows just about as well as my Pathfinder 2e games flow. Most of the classes, especially the martial classes, seem to be something that my players very effectively pick up and run with very easily. The spellcasting classes may be a little bit more confusing for players, but with time those seem to be caught up as well. And I will say that this initial dungeon, the Ghost levels, was pretty interesting in its design. You've got this central hub area that your players drop into with 4 very clear regions that they can explore in whatever order they wish. They have a very obvious goal that's driving them, find parts and a way to repower the elevator, and then they can just kind of tackle it in whatever manner seems best. This was a well-designed adventure, and the various pieces of the game that were explored in Chapter 1 all seem to be working pretty well. So my group has had a pretty positive experience with the first chapter of the adventure, A Cosmic Birthday. I do plan to head over to the Starfinder 2e playtest to leave some more detailed feedback, and I will be sure to include a link in the video description in case your group has a chance to play through this and you'd like to leave some feedback as well. If you all are interested to see how chapters 2 and 3 of this adventure go, let me know and I'll try to do some follow-up videos for those chapters once my party is done with them as well. But the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. Has your group played the Starfinder Playtest Adventure, A Cosmic Birthday, and if so, how did Chapter 1 go for them? Do you feel like the adventure was designed well and flowed smoothly, or were there certain points that were painful and didn't work out quite as well as you might have hoped? Were there things that worked really well for them or that your players adapted to quickly, and were there portions of the game that your players had trouble picking up? Jump down to the comments section and let me know what your experiences were. I am very excited about Starfinder 2e, and I would love to hear what your group's experience has been. Don't forget to do all the other stuff that helps to support the channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description. But, as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.